Committee on Science, Space, and Technology will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recesses of the committee at any time. Welcome to today's hearing entitled Paris Climate Promise, a Bad Deal for America. I'll recognize myself for an opening statement and then the ranking member. President Obama submitted costly new electricity regulations as the cornerstone of his agreement at the Paris UN Climate Conference last December. These severe measures will adversely affect our economy and have no significant impact on global temperatures. In Paris, the President pledged that the United States will cut its greenhouse gas emissions by as much as 28% over the next decade and by 80% or more by 2050. Moreover, the President's pledge creates an international agreement that binds the United States for decades to come, but lacks constitutional legitimacy since it has not been ratified by the Senate. The agreement not only requires the U.S. to reduce carbon emissions, but also compels our country to pay billions of dollars to developing nations to reduce their carbon emissions. Furthermore, even if all 196 countries continue their promised reductions for each year after 2031 until 2100, it will only reduce temperatures by 1/6 of a degree Celsius. The so-called Clean Power Plan will cost billions of dollars, cause financial hardship for American families, and diminish the competitiveness of American employers, all with no significant benefit to climate change. The U.S. pledge to the UN is estimated to prevent only 1/50th of 1 degree Celsius temperature rise over the next 85 years. EPA's own data shows that this regulation would reduce sea level rise by only 1/100th of an inch, the thickness of 3 sheets of paper. The President's power plan is nothing more than a power grab. A majority of Congress disapproved of the Clean Power Plan through the Congressional Review Act, and the governors of most states are challenging the rule in court. Meanwhile, the President attempts to justify his actions with scare tactics, worst-case scenarios, and biased data. An example of how this administration promotes its suspect climate agenda can be seen at the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. Its employees altered historical climate data to get politically correct results in an attempt to disprove the 18-year lack of global temperature increases. NOAA conveniently issued its news release that promotes this report just as the administration announced its extensive climate change regulations. NOAA has refused to explain its findings and provide documents to this committee and the American people. The people have a right to see the data, evaluate it, and know the motivations behind this study. Last week, over 300 respected scientists and experts, which include a Nobel Prize winner, members of the National Academy of Sciences, and former astronauts, sent this committee a letter that expressed concern over NOAA's efforts to alter historical temperature data. They agree that the issue deserves serious scrutiny. This administration continually impedes congressional oversight of its extreme climate agenda. Rightfully, Americans should be suspicious. Furthermore, statements by President Obama and others that attempt to link extreme weather events to climate change are unfounded. The lack of evidence is clear: no increased tornadoes, no increased hurricanes, no increased droughts or floods. For instance, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change found that there is, quote, low confidence on a global scale, end quote, that drought has increased in intensity or duration. The same lack of evidence can be found in the IPCC reports for almost every type of extreme weather. The administration's alarmism and exaggeration is not good science and intentionally misleads the American people. Congress has repeatedly rejected the President's extreme climate agenda. Now the administration attempts to create the laws on its own and has packaged all these regulations and promised their implementation to the UN. The President's Paris pledge will increase electricity cost, ration energy, and slow economic growth. It ignores good science and only seeks to advance a partisan political agenda. The President should present his Paris climate change agreement to Congress. He won't because he knows neither the Senate nor the House would approve it. As we will hear today, the President's UN climate pledge is a bad deal for the American economy, the American people, and would produce no substantive environmental benefits. That concludes my opening statement, and the ranking member, the gentlewoman from Texas, Eddie Bernice Johnson, is recognized for hers.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and good morning. Let me welcome our witnesses. And in particular, I'd like to thank Dr. Steer for returning today. Your testimony in December before the Paris conference was enlightening and greatly appreciated. Today, I look forward to discussing your takeaways from Paris, as well as your thoughts on appropriate steps that need to be taken to address climate change. The Paris Agreement formalized what many across the world already knew must be done to meaningfully address our most serious environmental challenge. Establishing a commitment to action, not for some but for all countries, is the first step toward a comprehensive global strategy to reduce carbon emissions. This commitment demands transparency. Again, not for some, but for all countries, to ensure that effective policies are put in place and that the objective of the agreement to limit the warming of our planet is accomplished. We can accomplish this in three ways. First, we need to support the private sector's growing recognition of the threats posed by climate change. In the United States alone, 154 companies signed on to the American Business Act on Climate Pledge. Through this pledge, companies like AT&T, Bank of America, Cargill, Coca-Cola, IBM, and even the Walt Disney Company are demonstrating their support for action by setting emission targets for their operations. As many of you will recall, days before the Paris climate talks, Bill Gates, along with a group of private investors, announced the creation of Breakthrough Energy Coalition, a coalition committed to investing in potentially transformative energy systems. Private sector efforts like this illustrate the potential impacts investments in technology can have on achieving both long and short-term carbon reductions. The Paris Agreement requires all governments to be consistent with their commitments and sends a signal to the private sector that a stable framework for action will be put in place, enabling private actors to invest, innovate, and inspire further action. Second, as our private sector responds to stable market signals, we must continue to identify opportunities for the federal government to invest in research and technologies that put us on a path to prevent a rise in global temperatures above 2 degrees Celsius. In addition to helping address climate change, investments in such innovative technologies will propel us forward into a new era of economic prosperity and environmental health. Third, we must capture the momentum of the Paris Agreement and take a leadership role in addressing the challenge of climate change and not just react to changes as they occur. Maintaining our international commitments demonstrates strength and provides certainty for all of our partners, including our private sector partners right here at home. As we act in a transparent manner to develop and implement policies to address our own carbon emissions, we will help move other nations to follow our example and achieve an impactful global response to climate change. I fear that we will hear today many of the same views and arguments that we've heard from the majority for years. They will warn us of the dire economic consequences of acting on climate change, or suggest that thousands of the world's most respected scientists are wrong about climate changing at all, or that any actions we take will be pointless. They will portray the Obama administration as overreaching. They will say all of these things, but the reality is that the audience for those views is shrinking. as the reality of climate change become evident. The rest of us acknowledge the task ahead and recognize that delay is not an option. We must move forward to support policies that will address our climate challenge and trust that our private sector will continue to innovate. The Paris Climate Agreement is a very positive development, and I hope that we can all build on it. And Mr. Chairman, I have a page here from the Washington Post dated Friday, December the 11th, 2015, that talks about the draft of the Paris Agreement. And it also has a second article that's entitled, "In Paris, Majority View in GOP Congress is in a minority." I thank you, and I yield back.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Johnson. Our first witness today is Mr. Stephen Eule, Vice President for Climate and Technology at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Prior to joining the Chamber, Mr. Eule was the Director of the Office of Climate Change Policy and Technology at the Department of Energy. And during this time, Dr. Eule represented DOE at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the G20, and other multilateral forums. He also previously served as a subcommittee staff director here at the Science Committee. So welcome back. Dr. Eule received his bachelor's degree in biology from Southern Connecticut State College and his master's degree in geography from George Washington University. I'll now recognize the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Palmer, to introduce our next witness.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is my pleasure and honor to introduce a fellow Alabamian. Our second witness is Dr. John Christy, Distinguished Professor of Atmospheric Science and Director of the Earth System Science Center at the University of Alabama in Huntsville. Dr. Christy, a data-driven climate scientist, has researched climate issues for 27 years and has been Alabama State climatologist since 2000. He was a contributor on 4 reports by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and was the lead author of a section of the 2001 IPCC Third Assessment Report. In addition, Dr. Spencer received NASA's Medal for Exceptional Scientific Achievement in 1991 for building a global temperature database, and in 2002 was elected a Fellow of the American Meteorological Society. Dr. Christy received his bachelor's degree in mathematics from California State University, Fresno, and his master's and PhD in atmospheric sciences from the University of Illinois. It's our pleasure to have you here, Dr. Christy. Thank you for testifying.
Thank you, Mr. Palmer. Our third witness today is Dr. Andrew Steer, President and CEO of World Resources Institute. Dr. Steer joined WRI from the World Bank, where he served as Special Envoy for Climate Change since 2010. Prior to this position, Dr. Steer was Director General and member of the Management Board at the United Kingdom Department of International Development. Dr. Steer worked at the World Bank for over 20 years and has held a number of positions that include Director of the Environment Department. Dr. Steer received his PhD in economics from the University of Pennsylvania. Our final witness is Mr. Stephen Groves, Senior Research Fellow at the Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom at the Heritage Foundation. Before joining Heritage in 2007, Mr. Groves was Senior Counsel to the U.S. Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. Mr. Groves received his bachelor's degree in history from Florida State, his master's degree in law from Georgetown, and his JD from Ohio Northern University. We welcome you all. Look forward to your testimony, and Mr. Eule, if you'll begin.
Thank you, Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Johnson, and members of the committee. It's a pleasure to be back here in the Science Committee. The main points I'd like to make, which are detailed in my written testimony, are as follows. First, the Paris Agreement clearly fulfills the Durban Platform's goal of an outcome with legal force, as it contains many legally binding provisions laying out what parties, quote, shall, unquote, do. These include requiring the parties to make future, increasingly ambitious mitigation pledges and to provide financing and technology assistance. The binding aspects of the Paris Agreement clearly require implementing legislation and regulation potentially affecting every sector of the U.S. economy. An agreement with such far-reaching consequences, if it is to be considered durable and binding both politically and legally, should be approved by Congress. Second, according to its own analysis, the Obama administration's emission reduction commitment for Paris doesn't add up. In a report released New Year's Eve, the administration estimates that 41% to 57% of the president's 2025 emissions target remains unaccounted for. And that's assuming EPA's Clean Power Plan survives court scrutiny, a big if. Even when including the administration's wish list of additional measures, in almost all cases, the projected emission reductions still fall short, and often well short, of the president's 2025 goal. That the administration, which has thus shown thus far no reticence when it comes to regulating greenhouse gases, still can't figure out how to reach its 2025 goal without everything breaking just right demonstrates how unrealistic its goal really is. Third, the Paris emissions pledges are hugely unequal and will not change appreciably the rising trajectory of global emissions. While the United States, Europe, Japan, and a few other countries have offered up deep emission cuts, nearly all developing countries, particularly the large emerging economies, have offered little beyond business as usual. Differentiation among the parties is alive and well. A recent report from the Framework Convention estimates that even in the unlikely event all the Paris pledges are implemented to the letter, global emissions will still rise nearly 1/5 between 2010 and 2030, within the range of where emissions were headed anyway. Fourth, the disparity in commitments results from the fact that most countries place greater emphasis on economic development than they do on cutting greenhouse gas emissions. More than 1 billion people worldwide still lack access to the modern energy services that could lift them out of poverty. Coal will remain for some time the fuel of choice for electrification in developing countries. Using data from Platts, we estimate that during the Paris climate talks, about 1.2 trillion watts of new coal-fired power plants were under construction or planned throughout the world. That's about 3.5 times the capacity of the entire U.S. coal fleet. This is not a carbon-constrained world. Fifth, the administration's plan will likely result in emissions from the U.S. leaking to other countries, merely moving, not reducing them. The United States has a tremendous energy price advantage over many of its competitors. Overregulation from EPA, however, could force energy-intensive industries to flee to other countries, similar to what we are seeing in Europe, where climate and other policies have driven up energy costs to industry 2 to 4 times higher than here in the United States. Sixth, developing countries have made it plain they will not undertake any meaningful commitments without large doses of financial aid. Developed countries have pledged $100 billion annually by 2020 and are expected to increase that amount by 2025. A great deal of the U.S. share of this funding will have to be appropriated by Congress. Seventh, although parties agreed to a non-binding aim to limit the global temperature increase to well below 2 degrees C from the pre-industrial level, the parties, as they have in the past, refused to agree to a global emissions pathway that they believe would be needed to meet this goal. It is exceedingly unlikely that they ever will. This temperature target, therefore, will remain what it has always been, a political symbol of little practical consequence. Finally, technology is the key. At its most fundamental level, reducing greenhouse gas emissions is a technology challenge. Existing technologies can make a start, but as we have seen, they are not capable of significantly cutting emissions on a global scale and at an acceptable cost. That is why the Chamber will continue to emphasize energy efficiencies and policies designed to lower the cost of alternative energies rather than raising the cost of traditional energy. In closing, back in 1997, the Clinton administration offered up an unrealistic U.S. goal, disregarded clear guidance from the Senate, and signed the Kyoto Protocol, a treaty it knew was politically untenable and therefore never bothered to submit to the Senate for its advice and consent. It now looks like the Obama administration may have repeated the mistake of ignoring Congress, signing on to a lopsided deal, and making promises future presidents and Congresses may be neither willing nor able to keep. As the late, great Yogi Berra once quipped, it's deja vu all over again. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Eule and Dr. Christy.
Smith and Ranking Member. Thank you, Chairman Smith and Ranking Member Johnson, for the opportunity to speak about climate change. I'm John Christy, Professor of Atmospheric Science at the University of Alabama in Huntsville, and Alabama's state climatologist. I've served in many climate science capacities, including as lead author of the United Nations IPCC. My research might best be described as building data sets from scratch to help us understand what the climate is doing and why. I begin with the chart on display. This particular chart has caused considerable anxiety for the climate establishment who want to believe the climate system is overheating according to the theory of how extra greenhouse gases are supposed to affect it. The message is very simple. The theory does not match the observations as measured independently by both satellites and balloons. With that, attacks on those of us who pay attention to such evidence and on the data themselves have been remarkably sophisticated. From congressional investigation of our finances, to well-funded videos, to reporters' inquiries for all of our notes, phone calls, expenses, reimbursements, emails, letters, and so on. At the core of these activities is the belief that someone who does not go along with the climate establishment must be on the payroll of scurrilous organizations. These attacks attempt to persuade people not to consider the data of the bulk atmosphere, the surface to about 50,000 feet. One attack says the satellites do not measure temperature. They do. As my colleague Roy Spencer points out, they measure temperature by emission, which is the same way a doctor measures your body temperature with an ear probe. Another attack says that the vertical fall of the satellites makes the readings unreliable. This problem was corrected 20 years ago for a different measurement, but the measurements shown here, this was never a factor involved. In a similar assertion, the claim is made that there was an error in the correction for the east-west drift of the satellites, but again, that does not apply to the measurements shown here, but to a different layer, and that was fixed 10 years ago. My written testimony goes into more detail about how these attacks on the data are misdirections or simply wrong. They are designed to divert your attention away from the critically important result of how significantly the theoretical impact of greenhouse effect on which policy is based differs from reality. It is a bold strategy on the part of many of the climate establishment to put one's confidence in theoretical models and to attack the observed data. To a scientist, this just doesn't make sense. My written testimony also examines issues excuse me, related to the surface temperature data sets. I attempt to make the case that the surface temperature measurements are less effective at detecting climate change than the bulk atmospheric measurements shown here. First, the variations of the basic physical measurement are not as directly related to greenhouse gas impact as is the upper air. And then there are other issues that affect the surface temperature, such as problems with human development around the stations and huge changes in the way the measurement was actually made through the years. What about the Paris Agreement? No one knows the impact of this agreement because no one knows whether any country will follow through on its voluntary aspirations at all. However, we do know that even so-called green countries like Germany and Japan are today adding to their carbon emissions by building more coal-fired power plants. And the rest of the world is moving forward with affordable carbon-based energy. These present trends of emissions indicate very little will be done because carbon-based energy is the foundation of the world's improving welfare, and I believe this will continue until something even more affordable is discovered. With no certainty on future emissions, I've done a thought experiment. As I note in my written testimony, if the United States had disappeared in 2015, that's no more people, no cars, no industry, nothing, the impact on the climate system would be a tiny few hundredths of a degree over 50 years. And that's if you believe climate models. So to me, it is not scientifically justifiable or economically rational that this nation should establish regulations whose only discernible consequence is an increase in economic pain visited most directly and harshly on the poorest among us. This happens when the scientific process that allegedly underpins regulations lacks objectivity and transparency and becomes associated with attempts to shut out any evidence that questions the regulation's assumptions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Christy. Dr. Steer.
Thank you very much indeed, Chairman Smith and Ranking Member Johnson. It's a great honor for me to be back in front of this committee again. My name is Andrew Steer, and I'm President and CEO of the World Resources Institute. WRI is a non-profit, non-partisan research institution. Our 500 professionals work in 50 countries. Mr. Chairman, the Paris Agreement is a big deal for the world and a good deal for America. It has transformed the climate change landscape. 187 countries submitted their climate pledges as part of an agreement, a remarkable level of participation that we've never seen before. Developed and developing countries are now united in a common framework as the US has been pushing for. The World Resources Institute has analyzed over a dozen major studies, adding up the pledges, and found that they will substantially reduce global emissions below our current path. They'll put us on a track for a world that warms 2.7 to 3.7 degrees Celsius, compared to a business-as-usual increase of 4 to 5 degrees Celsius. But they still don't go far enough to avoid some of the worst impacts of climate change. But fortunately, the agreement sets up the right conditions for future improvement. It establishes an ongoing, regular process to increase action every 5 years, with an ultimate goal of limiting temperatures well below 2 degrees Celsius. We believe the agreement strikes the right balance between what is legally binding and what is not. If the country targets had been legally binding, not so many countries would have signed up, probably including the United States. What is legally binding is a set of actions relating to measurement, reporting, transparency, and a review mechanism designed to ramp up ambition. In this regard, it's actually a very modern form of an agreement, particularly in the context of rapidly falling costs of green technology and a growing recognition that strong climate action is good for business. Countries like China and India have stepped up to the plate to take action. In 2015, China once again broke world records for the most wind and most solar capacity installed in 1 year, almost twice the investment here in the United States. India is aiming to install 100 gigawatts of solar power by 2022, 30 times the current level and 5 times higher than their previous target. Mr. Chairman, America's businesses and cities are supportive of the Paris Agreement. It wasn't just national governments taking action in Paris, it was CEOs, bankers, mayors, governors who were pushing the hardest for the deal and announcing new climate efforts of their own. 114 companies, including Coca-Cola and General Mills, committed to setting serious, ambitious emissions targets aligned to climate science. 63 companies, including Walmart, Google, and Microsoft, pledged to transition to 100% renewable power in the shortest practicable timeframe. The 6 biggest banks in the United States issued a statement in favor of a global agreement. 450 cities joined the Compact of Mayors, a coalition of city leaders dedicated to reducing emissions, including 120 from the United States. This flood of support is indicative of a new understanding of the relationship between climate change and the economy. Growing evidence from groups like the Global Commission on the Economy and Climate is proving that strong climate action is compatible with and actually even necessary for economic growth. And this is why 365 companies, including Adidas, Unilever, Gap, and Staples, wrote to US governors last year in strong support of the EPA's carbon pollution standards for existing power plants. They wrote, quote, "Our support is firmly grounded in economic reality. Clean energy solutions are cost-effective and innovative ways to drive investment. Increasingly, businesses rely on renewable energy and energy efficiency solutions to cut costs and improve corporate performance," unquote. The 365 companies who wrote this letter know that the smart money increasingly lies in the sustainable economy. Mr. Chairman, the United States is a leader in delivering improvements in energy efficiency, cleaner fuels, and new technologies. We're already seeing the benefits. Last year, the US solar industry added workers at a rate nearly 12 times faster than the overall economy. Transitioning to a clean energy economy will create hundreds of thousands of more jobs, increase GDP, and save families money on energy bills. But if unchecked, the negative economic impact of climate change will profoundly undermine the US economy. Mr. Chairman, our analysis shows that the US is already well positioned to meet its international climate commitments, but it will require continued strong leadership. The Paris Agreement was a great achievement, but now is the time to go to work. Thank you. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Steer. That was perfectly timed at 5 minutes. Mr. Rose.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for inviting me to testify today regarding the Paris Agreement on climate change and whether it's a bad deal for America. And I'll leave it to climate scientists and economists to say whether it's a bad deal for the economy. But as a lawyer, what I can say is that the Paris Agreement is a bad deal for the Constitution, for the separation of powers doctrine, and for the already strained relationship between Congress and the executive branch. Over the course of the past 7 years, President Obama has taken many unilateral actions of dubious legitimacy. the President's decision to treat the Paris Agreement as an executive agreement instead of a treaty is just his latest use of executive power to achieve an end that he knows full well would not pass congressional muster. The President's decision is particularly egregious because it flies in the face of an agreement made between the White House and the Senate in 1992. Back then, during the ratification debate over the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Senate was concerned that President Bush, or future presidents, would negotiate agreements that contained emissions targets and timetables, without submitting those agreements to the Senate. The Senate, then controlled by Democrats, required assurances that any future agreement containing targets and timetables be submitted for advice and consent. President Bush agreed on behalf of the executive branch, and the commitment was memorialized in the Senate's ratification documents for the Framework Convention. The next president lived up to this agreement. When President Clinton negotiated the Kyoto Protocol in 1997, he treated it as a treaty requiring the advice and consent of the Senate. But the Kyoto Protocol was so unpopular that the Senate passed a resolution of disapproval on it by a vote of 95-0 before it could even be submitted to the Senate. To his credit, President Clinton did not attempt to circumvent the Senate, nor did he simply declare that the Kyoto Protocol was an executive agreement that didn't require Senate approval. He lived up to the commitment that was made in 1992. But here we are in 2016 with a president that is unwilling to live up to the commitments of his predecessors. The president has negotiated a major climate change agreement under the auspices of the Framework Convention that contains targets and timetables, but he has refused to submit it to the Senate. The president is treating the Paris Agreement as an executive agreement, and the reason is simple: political expediency. The president knows that there are nowhere near 67 votes in the Senate to approve an agreement that requires the United States to send billions of dollars to the Green Climate Fund annually and in perpetuity, to make aggressive emissions reductions and to ratchet those reduction levels up every 5 years, and to submit itself to an international review committee that will shame the U.S. in the event that the U.S. does not live up to its obligations. Now, in addition to ignoring the 1992 agreement with the Senate, the president is simply pretending that the Paris Agreement isn't a treaty in its own right, even though the objective criteria used by the State Department indicate that the Paris Agreement is a treaty and not a mere executive agreement. Specifically, when the U.S. is negotiating an international agreement, the State Department uses something called the Circular 175 procedure to determine whether it is a treaty or an executive agreement. And as I detail in my written testimony, when you apply the 8 factors of the C-175 procedure to the Paris Agreement, it's very clear that it should be treated as a treaty. But the president has chosen to ignore the C-175 procedure in the same way that he has chosen to ignore the 1992 agreement between the executive branch and the Senate. As a result of the president's unilateral actions and his abuse of executive authority, in my view, the Paris Agreement lacks democratic legitimacy. For that reason, unless and until the Paris Agreement is submitted to the Senate, Congress should refuse to appropriate U.S. taxpayer dollars for the Green Climate Fund or any other financial mechanism associated with either the Paris Agreement or the Framework Convention. Congress should also continue to resist and disapprove all regulations meant to implement the Paris Agreement domestically. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for inviting me, and I look forward to answering any of your questions or the questions of the committee.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Groves. Let me direct my first question to Mr. Eule, and it is this. In your opinion, what are the costs of implementing the Paris Agreement to the United States? And when I mention cost, I include the impact on jobs as well. Make sure your mic is on there.
It's difficult to say what exactly the cost will be, but it's surely going to cost quite a bit. When you look at some of the projections for reducing greenhouse gas emissions significantly globally. We're talking trillions of dollars, perhaps tens of trillions of dollars in costs. And the U.S. share of that would depend on what happens in the negotiations, but it would be a significant amount. Now, when you talk about the $100 billion that's supposed to be mobilized by 2020, that's supposed to be ratcheted up by 2025. The U.S. share of that is under negotiation. And there's a big discussion within the Framework Convention as to whether that should be government funding or whether that should be private sector funding or a combination of both. But I think it's safe to say that a large percentage of that will have to come from the government, and that will be money that has to be appropriated by the Congress, and it's going to run into billions of dollars. The impact this is going to have on the United States is significant. The United States, as I mentioned in my testimony, has an energy price advantage over many of its competitors, 2 to 4 times. We pay 2 to 4 times less than many of our competitors in the OECD. You know, if that competitive advantage goes away, I think we can see a lot of energy-intensive industries fleeing the country, as we're seeing in Europe. We're seeing in Europe steel mills closing. We're seeing petrochemical plants saying, companies saying they're not going to be investing in Europe anymore. We're seeing power companies saying they're not going to invest in Europe anymore. The same thing could happen here, and I think that's why we have to take a strong look at the big disparity in what the U.S. is promising and what other countries are promising.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Eule. Dr. Christy, NOAA recently claimed to great fanfare that 2015 was the warmest year on record. This is the same organization that claimed 2014 was the warmest year on record. Then when we read the footnotes, they actually said they were only 38% sure that that was the case. In regard to their claim about 2015 being the warmest year on record, what are the weaknesses with the data they're using? How good is their accuracy?
Well, this is a new data set that's come out and hasn't had much scrutiny on it. We've tried to reproduce parts of it and have been unable at this point. It's a strange kind of way that it was constructed. Relative to 2015, we have a better way, I think, to measure the climate system, and that's the bulk atmosphere. That's where the real mass of the climate system exists in terms of the atmosphere. And 2015 was not the warmest year. It was either second to fourth, depending upon which data set you use. So the fact that that information is not provided to the American public by a government agency is disturbing to me, because the evidence is there that 2015 was not the warmest year.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Christy. Ms. Groves, thank you for your strong testimony, and appreciate especially your history of the 1992 agreement between the Senate and the executive branch, and also the definition of agreement and treaty as the State Department itself has determined. And it is breathtaking to have a president that ignores this and abuses his executive authority, in my judgment. My question is this: to what extent are President Obama's promises at the Paris meeting legally binding upon our country?
Well, I mean, there are commitments made throughout the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement is a legally binding agreement. Just because it's not, he doesn't consider it a treaty, doesn't mean it's not legally binding. Executive agreements can be legally binding, like status of forces agreements, or even the agreement that we're working out with Iran on the nuclear deal. The important thing to note is that the other 195 countries certainly believe that the United States will be legally bound by its commitments, not only its commitments to reduce its emissions on certain targets and timetables, but mostly important for them to transfer billions and billions of dollars annually to the Green Climate Fund and other climate mechanisms that they are going to use in their countries.
What power does the next president have? I mean, is the next president obligated to enforce what this president agreed to?
Well, the rest of the world would certainly believe that the next president would be required to live up to the U.S. commitments under the Paris Agreement. However, since the president currently characterizes the Paris Agreement as a mere sole executive agreement, any incoming president may withdraw from it in the same way it can withdraw from other executive agreements made with other countries. There are going to be political consequences to that with our allies, but unlike a treaty, It's much more simple to unwind a sole executive agreement.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Groves. And the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Johnson, is recognized for her questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Steele, before I ask you a question, I'd like to congratulate you on and all the staff at WRI for being named the #1 environmental policy think tank in the world by the 2015 Global Go-To Think Tank Index report. The launching of the Breakthrough Energy Coalition, the world's largest clean energy research and development partnership, is a prime example of the commitment by the private sector to addressing climate change. And it is clear that from your testimony that businesses have recognized the importance of taking action against climate change. Can you please comment on the importance of the private sector in addressing climate change?
Thank you very much indeed. Yes, I think one of the things that's happened in the last 5 years is a radical shift in our understanding about the link between economic growth and climate change. I was in Davos last week at the World Economic Forum. There's an overwhelming sense now on the part of business leadership in the largest companies in the world that actually we have to do something about climate change, and doing it smartly will make us more efficient, more competitive. And that's why you have these really remarkable sort of major companies. 1,000 companies have now said, we want a price on carbon. And one of the reasons for that is that they're currently living in no man's land. They don't know whether there is or there isn't going to be, and so investment is lower than it should be. And what we now know, there's a lot of empirical evidence that if you take smart actions on climate change, you can promote efficiency, you can bring in technology, and you can give long-term confidence, which is what business really needs. So it's a very exciting time. Now, one of the interesting things is that it's not only the manufacturers and the retailers, it's actually the financial sector as well. I mean, in Paris, 400 investors representing 24 trillion in assets have signed up to the Global Investment Statement on Climate Change, pledging to seek out and scale up low-carbon and resilient investments. And so what we're seeing, and it's very relevant to this committee, obviously, is that the agreement by the United States and 20 other countries to double their investment in research at the public level, plus the Bill Gates commitment together with another 25 billionaires, if you like, to really move things forward and a link together is an incredibly exciting development.
Yes. In his testimony, Mr. Eule stated that the emerging economies have shown very little interest in reducing emissions in any meaningful way, and that most developing countries will just continue to operate in a business-as-usual manner under this agreement. You have a much more optimistic view of the impact and effectiveness that the Paris Agreement will have on global emissions. Can you please elaborate on why you believe all countries, including developing countries, will deliver on this emissions reduction commitment?
I don't think it's that I'm optimistic. I think we look at the facts. We leave our opinions at home and we look at the facts. In China, most people still perceive China to be opening up hundreds of coal power plants and increasing their use of coal. In 2014, China shrank its consumption of coal. In the first 10 months of 2015, coal consumption in China fell by nearly 5%. So coal consumption in China is actually now peaking. We're not absolutely certain whether it will go up this year or not, but it looks like it's now on a downward trajectory. In the meantime, China invested $120 billion on renewable energy last year. So things are changing, and countries like Brazil are now committed to actually reducing in an absolute sense, as I think Mr. Eule made that in his written testimony, that an absolute reduction. And countries like Mexico as well are really doing very remarkable things.
Thank you. Now, what do you make of the claim that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce made that most businesses in the U.S. are opposed to this deal?
Well, I think we're still on a journey, quite frankly. Just because the United States as a whole, our economy and our society would benefit from serious action, that doesn't mean that every single industry and every single company. And the history of change is that those who have a vested interest in not changing are much more vocal, including in trade associations, than those who would benefit. And so we're on a journey, as we have been in many other areas, and each year we're seeing more and more coming on board, and we've seen it in the last 12 months in an unprecedented way.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to enter the articles I mentioned earlier into the record in my opening statement.
Without objection, so ordered. Thank you, Ms. Johnson, for your questions. And the gentleman from California, Mr. Rohrabacher, is recognized for his questions.
So let's talk about the economic impact, and maybe Mr. Eule would like to have his say on that as well. Mr. Eule, could you? We just heard about how it's going to be more efficient to go over to a non-carbon-based energy source. That's what we're really talking about. It's my understanding that oil and gas and coal, at their fundamental, is much more efficient than any other method that we've got at this point to produce the same amount of energy. Thus, if we're not using those efficient methods, that means that some sort of wealth is having to be consumed that otherwise wouldn't be consumed, which seems to me destruction of the manufacturing of wealth would hurt normal people. Maybe you could comment on that.
I think I understand the question.
I mean, fundamentally, at the economics, we're being told the economics is actually now working in behalf of moving in the direction, the global warming direction, pardon me, of making that a major goal of bringing down the climate, bringing down the temperature. Is that what your read? Obviously, it's not. Maybe you could just get into a discussion over that.
Yeah, I think when you look at where alternate technologies are, they're still more expensive than more traditional energy technologies. I think that's pretty plain. They have intermittency issues, and one of the questions is, can they be scaled up to provide the energy that people need to lift themselves out of poverty worldwide? When you think about climate change, like I said in my testimony, it's a technology challenge. And as long as alternate technologies are more expensive and less reliable than traditional technologies, people are going to use traditional technologies because it's more important, especially in the developing world, it's more important for them to provide energy to their people, and they will continue to use these technologies because they make sense. Once alternate technologies are competitive with traditional technologies, a lot of these issues go away, quite frankly. We won't need a big international conference to decide how to change the energy systems of these countries because people adopt these technologies anyway because they make sense. They don't at this point, but they will one day in the future, but we just don't know when that's going to happen.
So any businessman that runs a corporation that is not going to more efficient use of energy is wasting the resources of his company, and that would happen naturally. Hopefully, that people are making their adjustments to go to more efficient methods of using the energy for their company. Let me ask Dr. Christy, when we talk about what was the most, the hottest day, isn't this important? Because if indeed there's been this massive increase in this amount of CO2 in the atmosphere over these last 20 and 30 years, if indeed that has not resulted in these hottest days, does that not disprove the CO2 theory of that CO2 is causing the climate to change?
Okay, in terms of the hottest days, I think you're referring to the chart on when a number of 100-degree days occurred in the United States. That one that shows in the 30s many more occurred than today. So when you look at the United States record of extreme high temperatures, you do not see an upward trend at all. In fact, it's slightly downward. That does fly in the face of climate model projections. I just had a paper accepted for a publication in which we looked at Alabama and that very thing. Not one single one of the 76 climate models ran came close to producing what actually happened in Alabama's climate over the last 120 years. So I think my bottom line here is I would not trust model projections on which all policy is based here because they just don't match facts right now.
So if the facts are that we are not having this dramatic increase in temperature that we've been told that we're having, and at a time when CO2 has been increasing dramatically, the amount of CO2 going into the atmosphere has been dramatically increasing, well, then that would suggest that the CO2 theory of climate change is just inaccurate.
Well, I'm very happy to say you're acting like a scientist here. When a theory contradicts the facts, or the other way around, you kind of try to change the theory. And that's what we've shown is that the key metric, the bulk atmospheric temperature, is not obeying what climate models say. The real world is not going along with that rapid warming. And so that should tell us our understanding is not sufficient to explain what is happening in the real world. We don't know how CO2 is affecting the climate.
So the models based on this are obviously incorrect.
The models need to go back to the drawing board, I think.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Rohrabacher. And the gentlewoman from Maryland, Ms. Edwards, is recognized for her question. Oh, I'm sorry. The gentlewoman from Maryland is not here. The gentleman from California, Mr. Bear, is recognized. Doctor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, as a scientist and a physician, I agree. You gather the facts and you take those facts and you make a decision. I don't think anyone disputes that both NASA and NOAA look at 2015 as the hottest year on record. I don't think anyone disputes, you know, that climate does change. I mean, in my home state of California, we've gone through several years of devastating droughts, loss of the snowpack. I'm grateful that we're getting a lot of snow, and you know we're getting that snowpack, and we're getting a lot of rain in El Nino. But climate does fluctuate and it changes, so I think we can agree on that as well. You know, we do. If we look at extremes of climate, we're having more extremes of climate. If we take the fact that, you know, look at our poles, North Pole, Antarctica, you know, we're seeing more glacial melt-off and, you know, more extremes of melt. So those are the facts, and we should accept those facts. We can debate what's causing this, and we certainly should have that robust debate, but based on those, I think many of us take these as just objective facts of what's happening. We're seeing, you know, in my colleague, Congressman Derek Kilmer's district, you know, Native American tribes that have lived on coastal plains for thousands of years are now subject to chronic flooding and having to move to high ground. So, again, we can take those facts. This body then has to debate what can we do to help move us forward. You know, Dr. Steer, if I think about it, it can't just be one country moving forward because we're talking about a global climate. The reason why you have to act as an international community is setting targets. And again, I think what I was pleasantly surprised about at the Paris Accords is, you know, some of the countries that we have the most concern about, countries like India, who I think many of us thought could really undermine the Paris Accords, really stepped up to the plate. I mean, and this is a country that will be making massive investments in energy. You know, that 300 million Indians have no reliable electrical source. There is a real opportunity to come up with innovative electrical sources in a very different way, using alternative and renewable energies. And, you know, I guess, Dr. Steer, as we look at this, you've already indicated corporate America gets the economic opportunity here. Many of us get the job creation opportunity here. And what would you say if, you know, the next concrete steps and also what the facts are?
Well, thank you, Congressman Berra. I agree very much with you. Look, no individual country operating on its own can address this problem. Global problems require international cooperation. That's been massively lacking for the last quarter century. And what we've seen in the last year, actually, is potentially the emergence of a new multilateralism. And it's a multilateralism led by the United States, because the United States, including the George W. Bush administration and the current administration, have said, look, we are not going to put ourselves under some global treaty. We are going to have a situation where we are going to pledge, we're going to be transparent, And something very dynamic is going to happen. And it's going to happen because costs are falling and because signals will be given to the private sector. And what we have now in the Paris deal is precisely that. It's actually a very modern type of deal, because it's not based upon sending you to prison or sending you a requirement to pay something if you don't deliver. It's rather saying, look, we are going to move in a certain direction. Every year that passes, costs are falling. And that's why Prime Minister Modi, as you say, he came into power. He didn't come in, committed to the environment. He came in to promote economic growth. He looked at his solar targets, which were 20 gigawatts by 2022, and he said, let's quintuple them to 100. Why did he do that? It wasn't because he, wanted to look good on the international stage. He actually did it because he wanted to promote a new industry. He wanted the notion that there were factories that are going to be built, and that's exactly what he's going to do, and that's why China is spending $120 billion on renewable energy last year. So something is going on out there that is going to lead to an upward ratchet.
Because the economics make sense. And if we want to be smart and we're looking at 21st century industry, I want our companies to be creating those new energy sources. I want our companies to lead solar and wind, the thousands of jobs that are going to be created. And again, let's be smart about this, and let's win this. And this is smart business, it's smart investment, and it does protect our planet for the next generation. It's the right thing to do, so thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Bear. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Weber, is recognized for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Steer, in your exchange with my good friend Eddie Maurice Johnson from Texas, you got pretty exuberant one time, and you said there's 25 billionaires involved. You remember that exchange with her? You remember that? Yeah. So I take it, because of the, I guess, status of being a billionaire, I take it in this current presidential campaign you would be a Donald Trump supporter? So here's my question for you, Dr. Steer. If climate change theory is right, assuming that all other countries comply, that all the other countries comply and don't cheat, then we will all stay equal, as it were, quote unquote, in our respective competitive positions. We're talking about global marketing now. But if the theory is wrong, or if countries cheat, not that they would ever do that, the U.S. stands to lose the most in terms of our competitive position. Does either one of those two scenarios I just laid out concern you?
Well, as I think it was Mr. Eule made the point that actually at the moment the United States, for example, has a great cost advantage in electricity. Consider the steel industry. In Indiana, the cost of electricity to the steel industry is about 60% what it is in Hebei province, which is the sort of big steel section of China. Under the U.S. Clean Power Plant, the estimation is that electricity prices will rise between 5 and 10%, and then would fall back down again. So even under that, we don't have to worry about the competitiveness of the United States steel industry. The academic evidence.
That's really my question is, are you concerned about either one of those two scenarios, whether we lose our competitiveness or that the other countries would cheat? Are you concerned about either one of those?
I fear that we will lose our competitiveness if we do not act on climate.
If you don't act. Yeah. Mr. Eule, let's go to you. Do I need to lay out those two scenarios again?
Congressman, it's a very big concern. I mean, all you have to do is look at what's going on in Europe. In Europe, energy-intensive industries are becoming an endangered species. And they're even recognizing now that they have a real problem. And when you talked five years ago in Europe about energy, it was all focused on climate change. Now there's still a focus on climate change, but they're talking more now about competitiveness and how they're going to position themselves in a competitive world. And I think we're headed down the same path if we're not careful. And I would like to point out about China and China's adoption of renewable energy. It's also true that China has under construction planned about $460 billion watts of coal-fired power plants. And India has about 360 billion watts of coal-fired power plants, either planned or under construction.
So are you suggesting we sic the EPA on them?
Well, I'm just saying, you know, India made a pledge in Paris, and after Paris, they still said that they're going to go ahead with their goal to double coal production in India in 5 years. So while a lot of countries are making baby steps toward renewables and alternative technologies, coal is still going to be the go-to fuel for providing electricity in these countries.
Okay, thank you. And Dr. Christy, I'm coming to you, those same two scenarios. Are you concerned about either of those two scenarios?
Well, I look, you talk about if the climate models are wrong.
Well, if climate change theory is right, okay, then assuming all countries comply and don't cheat, and we all stay equal, as it were, in our respective competitive positions. But if it's wrong, or if those countries cheat, then we lose our competitive position. Are you concerned about that?
Well, the one I study is the climate model issue the most, and the evidence to me indicates they're wrong. The data is not matching up with.
And you're very concerned about that?
I'm very concerned. That's why I showed the picture.
Let me move on to Mr. Groves. Thank you. Mr. Groves, I know you raised the constitutional issue, which I appreciate, and I'm concerned about that. But just us, you and me talking now, the scientists don't get the constitutional issue. So
And I don't get the
you
science.
didn't hear me say that, right? But would you be concerned about this scenario as well?
Well, the area that I would be concerned about is noncompliance by the other parties. I mean, the U.S.
Thank you.
tends to take its treaty commitments much more seriously than other countries. That goes to arms control treaties, that goes to human rights treaties. And even if the U.S. joined this one and lived up to the letter of its commitments, I wouldn't be confident that countries like India or China or even developing countries around the world would find it economically feasible to live up to their commitments.
So we would be tying our, as it were, proverbial arm behind our back.
Since we would be complying and they
Absolutely.
would not, yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Weber. And the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Byers, recognized for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. Dr. Christy, it was fun to read about your resume, and I understand your emphasis on this bulk atmosphere measurement. I mean, I saw you won a very distinguished award from NASA in 1991 for your work on that, a special medal from the American Meteorological Society in 1996 for your work on that. And you lay out the criticisms of other climate scientists about using atmospheric data. You talked about that they say you're only measuring radiation, not temperature, that you don't allow for orbital decay and vertical drop, that you don't allow for the diurnal drift problem, the east to west. And then you also respond and say, no, but you've adjusted for all that stuff. But then you go on to criticize the surface measurement, saying, 1 meter deep in the ocean is not the same as 3 meters above, that there's infrastructure buildup that they don't allow for. In fact, you even say, I quote, those who measure at the surface use, quote, unsystematic measuring methods and instrumentation, unquote. So question number one is, does it make sense to use all of the data we have, both yours and the stuff on the surface? And number two, does it really make a difference whether 2015 was the first warmest or the second or fourth, if we're looking at all recorded data? And three, doesn't it make sense to look at what's really happening, not between 20,000 and 50,000 feet, where we don't live, but here, where we have sea level rise all on the Virginia coast, where the surges in Norfolk, Virginia are getting worse and worse and worse as developed by Lockheed. The migration of animals, the migration of insects, and the decimation of forests in the north, the migration of tropical diseases, which is on the front page of the papers these days, the disappearing Arctic ice and Greenland ice and other stuff. Shouldn't we put all of these things together as opposed to, you don't like the models, but let's also look at what's happening to our lives?
Try to back up with those. I might have to ask you to remind me what the question was.
That's all right.
But for the third one, the bulk atmospheric temperature is where the signal is the largest. So that's where you go to look for it if you're a scientist. We have measurements of that. It doesn't match up with the models. Now, all those other things you mentioned, if you take systematic measurements back 1,000 years for those very issues you talked about, I'll bet you'll see the same type of variations. The droughts mentioned in California, they were 100 years long when you go back about 900 or 800 years, not just 4 years as this one has shown. So I think there's a little bit of hyperbole in all those things that people see changing right now. They've always changed, I suspect. What was your second question? And then we'll get
Does it make any difference whether it's the first warmest or the second or fourth?
No, individual years, no, it's really not critical on that. It's the longer-term trend, which is what I was showing. That's the more critical parameter because it talks about the accumulation of heat. It's not happening the way models project it to. And number one was?
That's good. I would have loved to have seen the rest of that. You stopped at 2025 or 2020 to see where it went in 2050 and 2100.
It just kept going. It just kept going.
Kept going up.
Yeah.
Mr. Eule, he's talked really fascinating from a chamber perspective. I'm a businessman also. That you're going to look at where the cost effectiveness of the technologies are. That when solar and wind and tidal and stuff begin to approach the cost of fossil fuel, the problem will take care of itself. ExxonMobil has come out for a carbon tax, carbon pricing. I had a good conversation with the chairman of BP in Davos last week who said they also support a carbon tax. Would the chamber support a carbon tax to bring these different methods into balance, especially if all of the revenue was returned to the American citizens, so it was revenue neutral?
Well, we would have to see what the proposal looked like. We've never said we were opposed to a carbon tax, never said we were in favor of a carbon tax, never said we were opposed to cap and trade, never said we were in favor of cap and trade. We always have to see what the legislation says, and then we make a decision.
Okay, that's fair. Thank you very much. Dr. Stier, it's been alleged that all the Paris agreements and stuff will have a devastating economic impact. How do you reconcile that with the fact that since 2009, no country in the world has reduced its carbon footprint more than the United States, and we've had 70 straight months of private sector job growth, 18 million new jobs since January 20th, 2009. How do you put those together?
Well, I agree with you, Congressman, that actually this is part of this learning that we're doing right now. In the United States, we here in this economy are on the forefront of something we didn't understand before, which is if you actually focus on the efficiency of economy, you will want to emit less greenhouse gases. And smart policies for climate change will lead to more efficiency, more technology, more long-term certainty. So I mean, I think you're absolutely right. The Global Commission on the Economy and Climate, which is chaired by President Felipe Calderon, the previous president of Mexico, a conservative president of Mexico, you know, he said, you know, that when I was a young politician, he said, I believe there was a trade-off between climate action and economic growth. When I was president and I was chairing the G20, I believed that actually economic growth and climate action could be compatible. He said, now I've looked at the facts and I know that long-term healthy economic growth is only possible with climate action. So I agree very much with you, Congressman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Byer. And the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Posey, is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Several of you have, and almost everybody else has referenced the increase in cost, energy cost to Americans, and this is all about energy. And further down the chain, the increases affect virtually every product or service of every American. Example, I talked to some people in the cement manufacturing business, and they sit under the proposed EPA rules now if they're allowed to go into effect. In my state, half the manufacturer will close immediately, and the other half will be able to hang on for a year, long enough to get reestablished in Mexico. And I don't think there's any environmental protection regulations of significance in Mexico regulating cement and the manufacturing. And so, you know, unless you believe in such a thing as a no-peeing section of a swimming pool, you know, we still get the pollution, we just pay 400% more for the product, you know. So I wondered if Mr. Eule and Mr. Groves, you would express to us the bottom line of your thoughts about the UN climate negotiation. Do you think this is simply an attempt to transfer wealth, or do you see other more legitimate purposes?
Sure. Both Mr. Eule and I were there in Paris during these negotiations, and we can tell you from firsthand experience that the big issue in Paris was money. I studied not just agreements like these, but other agreements that deal in wealth transfers from the global north to the global south, from the developed world to the developing world, and the Paris Agreement is no exception to the general trend in global UN agreements regarding global wealth transfer. And if it's enforced, that's essentially what will happen. Only the developed countries are required to pay into the Green Climate Fund, which is going to be $100 billion a year as a floor beginning in the year 2020. And all of those dollars go to the developed world, which is in the global south. So if that's not kind of a global wealth transfer, I'm not sure what is.
I would say there are mixed incentives in the talks. But I think what's interesting is what Christiana Figueres said. She's the Executive Secretary of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And so my testimony, and I'll quote what she said, quote, "This is the first time in the history of mankind that we are setting ourselves the task of intentionally, within a defined period of time, to change the economic development model that has been reigning for at least 150 years since the Industrial Revolution," end quote. So I think a lot of people see these talks as a way to change the economic development system. And I think that's something we should be concerned about, because the free enterprise system that we have has been responsible for the biggest boost in human health and welfare in history. And so I think we have to be cautious about where these talks go.
And I agree, and I hadn't intended to make this comment, but you know, we won the Second World War. The world is more free today because we had enabled industrialists to produce, and we outproduced the enemy. And here, I mean, I think most people have the common sense to understand that most of the rest of the world is in favor of us being less productive if it makes them more productive. But based on so much that we've seen in the governments that they're actually trying to help with our money here, do you think that's any probability that the funds would be properly used, or would we see more waste, fraud, and abuse like we have with many of the other resources we use to disperse Americans' wealth to other people?
I think certainly if Congress is going to be appropriating the money that goes into the fund, Congress should have a say in how it's spent. And there are rules that are being set up in the Green Climate Fund to oversee how the money is being spent. But, you know, I think the focus on the Green Climate Fund is a little bit misplaced, because a lot of the money is not going to go through the Green Climate Fund. Even the Obama administration has said we're not going to be sending $100 billion through the Green Climate Fund. That is just not going to happen. A lot of it's going to go through the World Bank. A lot of it's going to go through other development banks. Some of it will go through the Green Climate Fund. But it's going to come from the $100 billion that the developed countries have pledged to mobilize is going to be coming from a lot of different sources. And so that makes it a little bit more complicated to track actually who's providing the money and where it's going.
Yeah, there's just such a historical problem with corruption in those processes every time we get involved. I see my time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Posey. The gentleman from California, Mr. Swalwell, is recognized.
Thank you, Chair. And I'm glad Mr. Posey brought up World War II, because when I think of the challenges of the 20th century and what we're facing now in the 21st century, it was America's role in World War II that really it changed the dynamic of that cause. And I think the world is a better place because America acted. And Dr. Steer, I'm wondering, what does climate change look like if America does not act? Like if we were, you know, in this next, I think, greatest challenge to the world since, you know, World War II, probably separate from, you know, extreme terrorism, is climate change. And what happens if the United States does not act?
The United States is the indispensable leader in terms of the technologies that are required, the pro-market approaches, the pro-business, pro-growth approaches. That is the only way we can address it. This is something that the United States is uniquely qualified to lead in. We would not have the Paris deal had the United States not been a leader there. And so we look forward to continued leadership.
And Dr. Steer, are you familiar with the U.S. military and its belief on whether or not climate change is happening and whether or not it should adjust in its modeling for the future.
Yes, look, the United States military is a leader in understanding climate change. It, more than most other institutions, has said we have to act because climate change is affecting us in several ways. It's making the world much less secure. It's also raising our costs, quite frankly. The U.S. Navy, as you know, is exploring just how much it is going to cost to raise the moorings for its ships, given that they're projecting over a meter rise in sea level this century. So the U.S. military and actually NATO. I met last week with the head of NATO, ex-Prime Minister Stoltenberg in Davos, and NATO is concerned, deeply concerned about climate change.
Great. Thank you, Chair, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Swalwell. The gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Lucas, is recognized for his question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I would like to introduce into the record a letter led by my friend from Oklahoma, Congressman Mark Wayne Mullen and Congressman Tim Murphy, signed by myself and 26 other colleagues.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The letter was sent to the EPA seeking clarification on potential EPA plans to embed U.S. federal employees in foreign countries to help monitor their progress towards the Paris Climate Promises goals. The EPA has yet to respond to the letter, but I'm hopeful they will take the letter seriously and address our concerns soon. With that, Mr. Groves, are you concerned that the EPA is going beyond their legal authority by sending employees overseas?
Well, that article in that letter is the first I've heard of this, Mr. Lucas. But I think what it does show is kind of the mischief that our federal agencies can get themselves into once you have something like the Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Paris Agreement being signed. Is you have something that they can point to that authorizes them to engage in this type of international cooperation. I mean, I would be interested in seeing where the funding is coming from to pay U.S. employees taxpayer dollars to go help other countries with their climate change issues. But from a legal standpoint, you know, when the president signs things and treats them as executive agreements, like he's treating the Paris Agreement, then it gives agencies like the State Department and the EPA clearance to go out and do this, or at least some type of justification they can point back to. But I think it's something that's worthy of further examination.
Absolutely. Mr. Eule, on principle, I'm wholeheartedly disagree with the concept of devoting U.S. taxpayers' money to enforce an international agreement that the Senate's not yet even ratified. That being said, I understand it's the EPA's intent to move forward and help China get a handle on its greenhouse gas emissions. Do we really have a clue how much greenhouse gas China's emitting?
No, Congressman, we don't. There was an interesting report in the New York Times a few months ago, which said that Chinese had been underestimating their coal consumption by 17%. Just to give you an idea of how big that is in emissions terms. That's equivalent to the greenhouse gas emissions, not just CO2 emissions, but the greenhouse gas emissions of Germany. So this is not a trivial error. And one of the aspects of the Chinese pledge is to set up a trading system, emissions trading system. And you know, the question I have is, how can you set up an emission trading system when you really don't know what your emissions are? So yeah, that's a big problem. And it's not just with China, by the way. I think this is a problem a lot of developing countries have. They really don't have a handle on how much they're emitting.
So it's hard to enforce agreement that you don't have any details for at home. You don't have any facts to work from of substance.
Well, I mean, one of the things in the Paris Agreement is to set up a system where they're supposed to be able to do that, but we'll just have to see how that works out.
Absolutely. Well, it'll be fascinating to see how the EPA responds on this concept of sending U.S. employees out to enforce agreements that the Senate hasn't yet approved. With that, Mr. Chairman, I await with intensity on our friends at the EPA to respond, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Lucas. And the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Veazey, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Steer, I wanted to ask you about the transfer of wealth from developed to developing nations. That was a part of this agreement. Can you comment on that a little bit and why it's important to include a financial mechanism in the agreement, and what are the consequences for the U.S. not committing resources to developing nations?
Thank you, Congressman. Yes, the $100 billion that is often referred to is not all public money. It includes private money. It includes the money that comes from the private sector that can actually be stimulated by the public money. And only a very small portion of that will go through the Green Climate Fund, by the way. Most of it will go through many other channels, as Mr. Eule says. Look, countries in Africa are severely affected by climate change. I think the science is pretty clear on that. Yields will, other things being equal, decline. And it's quite frankly, it's not pleasant if you are a very poor farmer and your yields decline further. They need help on new seeds. We know how to do that. So too, of the 1 billion people that would be affected very seriously by a rise in sea level of a meter, most of those are poor. Most of them are living in very low-lying areas. They need help, quite frankly. And so to us, it's pretty obvious that, that poor people require help. It needs to be provided in link with private investment, and it needs to be provided in a way that promotes jobs and growth. So, I mean, quite frankly, under the agreement in Paris, the obligation for the United States or any other country to give any specific amount of money does not exist. That is not a legal obligation. What is required is that we are transparent about the extent to which we are willing to help low-income countries.
You know, kind of in that same lane, when it comes to opportunities for American businesses being able to export technologies to the developing world, what kind of opportunities do you see there?
Oh, look, I think that I am pretty confident that for every dollar of public money that the United States puts in to help developing countries on their mitigation, on their adaptation, because it will be leveraged with private investment, I'm pretty confident that more than $1 will come back to the United States in terms of additional trade and investment.
Well, yeah, that's remarkable. Thank you, Dr. Steer. I appreciate it. Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time.
And thank you, Mr. Veazey. And the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. LaHood, is recognized for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and want to thank the witnesses for being here today and your testimony. Mr. Groves, wanted to ask a couple questions on the legal issues and constitutional issues. Obviously, I was not in Paris. It sounds like you were, and many of the panelists were. In terms of the discussion that went on why this was not a treaty and an agreement or a promise, you know, it seems like so much of our foreign policy is premised on the rule of law, our democracy, constitutional democracy, how we do things in our country. And so when the question is asked by other countries or other entities, why is this not a treaty? And that's posed to this administration, what's the response? And what are the consequences of that?
Well, the response, and it's not like our delegation was shy about this in Paris. The response was, you know, we cannot get this through the Senate, and so that's why we're not going to treat it as a treaty. This didn't come out of the blue when White House spokesman Josh Earnest was asked about this in March of last year, about whether the Senate would be able to review the Paris Agreement. He said, well, I don't really think that the Senate, who's full of climate deniers, should have a say on making climate change policy. And when the host of the Paris conference, Laurent Fabius of France, the foreign minister, was asked about this, he said, well, no matter what we do, we can't have an agreement that would have to go to the U.S. Congress because it's not going to pass. So it was the biggest open secret in Paris that whatever they agreed to, it would have to be something that the U.S. would have to come back to the United States and not have to pass congressional muster with. So although the rest of the world will require and expect the United States to live up to its mitigation reduction commitments and live up to its financial commitments to send billions of dollars every year, the fact that it didn't have any type of congressional scrutiny, I think really speaks to the legitimacy of the agreement.
And in terms of the commitments and promises made in this non-binding agreement, tell me how that affects our domestic law, and how is that binding on corporations here, and whether there's compliance or non-compliance, and is there precedent for that?
Well, it's a clever thing that the White House did, is you go and you make an international commitment in Paris, you bypass Congress completely, and then you go to enforce it domestically through EPA regulations. So there's a lack of democratic legitimacy on almost every level of the creation of this document and its enforcement. And these EPA regulations, like the Clean Power Plan, will be litigated. You know, Congress has passed resolutions disapproving of them. But of course, those EPA regulations will be binding on U.S. corporations.
And Mr. Eule, I would just, following up on that, it seems incongruent to me that we continually around the world talk about democracy and constitution and the system of government we have here, but we are doing this the opposite way here, and not going through the treaty process, which of course is cloaked with the legalities that are binding. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, I think, if you want a durable climate change agreement, a durable climate change policy, you have to involve Congress. It's as simple as that. And this administration has chosen not to do that. And so the question is this a durable treaty, politically and legally? And I would venture to say that the answer is no.
Thank you. Those are all my questions, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. LaHood. And the gentlewoman from Oregon, Ms. Bonamici, is recognized for her questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of our witnesses for appearing before the committee. I represent Northwest Oregon, and climate change is a very important issue for my constituents. I go out to the Oregon coast. That's the western boundary of my district. People there rely on a healthy ocean. You may have heard of our famous Pinot Noir wine from Yamhill County, Oregon. They need a particular climate for those grapes to grow well. We have entrepreneurs who are developing new clean energy technologies. So there are many Oregonians who are working to address and mitigate climate change. In fact, this weekend I'm looking forward to meeting with the Willamette Valley Wineries Association, and they want to talk about climate change, and they're calling it climate migration. We're getting people coming up from California. It's too dry, it's too hot. I don't want to lose our industry to our wonderful state to the north or to Canada. So I wanted to also talk about shellfish growers on the Oregon coast, and they've spoken with me about significant losses because of ocean acidification. Oyster production is a multi-million-dollar industry on the West Coast. It supports thousands of jobs. And ocean acidification is threatening that industry, but also not just in Oregon, Gulf of Mexico, New England, the mid-Atlantic. And this issue doesn't just matter to coastal representatives. All of us have restaurants and grocery stores and people who eat shellfish in our districts around the country. So Dr. Steer, I wanted to ask you a little bit about how climate change affects oceans and as a result our fisheries, what happens to the fish population, migration, and food chain dynamics. And if you could also comment about the recent El Nino and how it's affecting the West Coast fisheries. And then I do want to save time for another quick question, please.
Well, look, I think the understanding of science is firming up year by year. The impact on fisheries is potentially very great indeed. We know a lot about where fish come from. We know how their habitat can be spoiled by acidification and by rising temperatures. And so there's now a very large literature on this. So I think your constituents are right to demand action for that. Over the last year, as you know, there was a very major piece of work called Risky Business that looked at the impact of climate change at the county level throughout the entire United States. It was sponsored by Hank Paulson and by Michael Bloomberg and by Tom Steyer, so you had the entire political spectrum that were there. And it was quite devastating, quite frankly. And so we need to look at these facts. Now, obviously, the science is not absolutely firm, and so it's very legitimate. There'll be some scientists on different sides, but you've got to look at the bulk of where the scientific opinion is, and it's crystal clear.
Thank you. And Dr. Steer, I know you were in Paris. Welcome back to the committee. I know there's been some discussion already this morning about U.S. leadership, but I wanted to really follow up and have you expand on that. The United States has a long history of leading on global issues that have ramifications beyond our own borders, whether it be human rights, world health, technology, innovation. We ought to be applauding the administration for being ready to lead the international response to climate change. And we have, in a relatively short period of time, seen developing countries step up and make commitments to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. So I wanted you to comment on the perception in Paris about the role of U.S. leadership, but also, would you please address this lack of, some people are saying the lack of a binding mitigation commitment in the agreement as a negative, and there's this naming and shaming concept. Could you comment on that, and can meaningful carbon reductions be achieved without legally binding mitigation commitments? How can we effectively enforce that?
Look, in Paris, there was, Congresswoman, there was a remarkable gratitude for the United States leadership, and I would, I think we should be proud of that, actually, and this committee should be proud of that. We wouldn't have the deal without United States leadership, but it's a mistake to say that only the United States didn't want, the country deals to be, or the country promises to be legally binding. Many, many other countries, including some of the most important in the world, said, count us out if we are going to have legally binding. So this was something that was negotiated. In our view, and remember, we don't have a dog in this race. We are a research institution. Having looked at this very carefully with our legal scholars, our scientists, our economists, our view is actually the balance between legally binding and non-binding. Given where we are as a civilization today and a global polity today, we believe this is a smart decision. And we believe there's a potential dynamic that's going to go on whereby as costs fall, as we learn more, as private sector leaders, and I loved what you said about the United States leadership, because the great thing about the United States leadership is it's not just government. Right. It actually, it's Apple, it's Walmart, it's a whole range of issues, Amazon, Kohl's, Verizon, they've all made huge commitments. These are powerful institutions that are part of the partnership of change.
Terrific. Thank you. My time has expired. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Bonamici. And the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Babin, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the witnesses for being here. Quite frankly, I'm very concerned that there is going to be a very harmful and detrimental impact on the United States of America, including and especially my district in Texas, in the 36th Congressional District. Mr. Eule, the regulations associated with climate change will increase the cost of energy for American citizens, especially hardworking families already struggling to get by. I would like to ask you if you could describe how the increased energy costs will impact the macro economic health of the United States, both for primary energy users and also end-use consumers.
Well, thank you. NERA Consulting took a look at the Clean Power Plan, and it concluded that electricity rates would rise between 10 and 14%. And so that's obviously going to have a big impact on the poor, minorities, the elderly, and people on fixed incomes. They also estimated that this would result in $64 to $79 billion in losses to consumers. And, when you think about the energy price advantage we have over other countries, we have to, ask ourselves, is this really the road we want to go down? So I think it could have a very devastating impact on consumers and on businesses.
Okay, and then to follow that up, would U.S. jobs be lost if these electricity and natural gas prices increase for energy intensive trade-exposed manufacturers here in the United States?
Yeah, almost certainly they will be. Again, we have a tremendous energy advantage here, and we have to thank the oil and gas industry and the fracking revolution that's going on in this country.
Right.
And we have a completely different energy situation than they have in many parts of the world, and we need to protect that.
Okay, well, if our colleagues on the other side of the aisle, we're being told that these new green jobs are going to increase the incomes of a lot of extra people. Would these green jobs be enough to offset the manufacturing jobs we're talking about losing from the recent U.S. promise at the Paris negotiations?
It's very difficult to say, but I will say this. When you look at the last 7 or so years since the recession, the one shining star in the U.S. economy has been the oil and gas sector.
Right.
And that's because of fracking. From the end of 2007 to today, employment in that sector has increased by about 38, 39, 40%. Well, for the rest of the economy, it stayed pretty much flat. We're pretty much back where we were back in 2007. So the one shining spot here has been the oil and gas sector, and that's because of innovation, and that's because of the entrepreneurship of U.S. companies, many of which are small and mid-sized companies. So the shale revolution in the United States has been a great boon to our economy.
Okay, to even go further with what you just said, if you could elaborate on what the abundance of affordable natural gas via this hydraulic fracking means in terms of contributing to a cleaner environment. What can the fracking boom and the new technology, what does that mean for a cleaner environment and increased standards of living, both here in the United States and around the globe? There will be a positive impact in that regard as well. Don't
Absolutely. And this is one thing I think that doesn't get enough attention in the international negotiations, to be perfectly honest with you. These people, these negotiators, they live in a bubble. I remember talking to a negotiator a couple of years ago, and I mentioned the fracking revolution, and I said, this is going to create headwinds for any sort of agreement. And he looked at me and he said, is this fracking thing for real? Yes, the fracking thing is for real. When people were talking about a few years ago peak oil, we're not talking about peak oil anymore. We have more oil than we know what to do with. We have more natural gas than we know what to do with. There are shale formations throughout the entire world. This is going to be a tremendous boom for economies, not just in the United States, but for those economies that can develop their shale resources. And so when I look at this, and then I look at the Paris Agreement, and I look at where people are actually putting their money. I mean, people talk green, but they're putting their green into shale, they're putting the green into oil, they're putting their green into natural gas, and they're putting their green into coal because it's cheap, affordable, and scalable. So I think the shale revolution potentially is going to have a huge impact globally, maybe not in the next 5 years, but certainly beyond that.
I know it's had a huge impact on my state, the state of Texas.
And a very positive impact for not only for Texas, but for North Dakota and Pennsylvania and Ohio and Colorado and many other places.
Right. Thank you. Thank you so very much. And my time's expired, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Babin. And the gentlewoman from Connecticut, Ms. Esty, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Johnson, for holding today's hearing to examine policy issues surrounding the United States pledge at the recent UN conference to curtail greenhouse gas emissions. I come from the great state of Connecticut, where we have found and shown that good environmental protection leads to economic growth, not the contrary. And when I look at a world where the human species needs two things, clean water and clean air to survive, we need clean energy to be affordable and available to the entire world. So I'd like to follow up on some of the issues raised by my colleagues, because I think in Connecticut, where we're part of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, where our state and our governor have been leaders on financing clean energy projects as well as conservation projects that are bringing down the cost of energy and spurring innovation that is leading to job creation in our state. The three quick topics for you, Dr. Steer. Can you talk about the following? First, can you talk about the value of a bottom-up approach? I know you were part of that in Paris, about the reason we've got U.S. mayors, states, Canadian provinces, and most importantly, major U.S. corporations who are investing in these efforts because they see the dollar imperative to do so for world markets. Number two, can you talk about the health impacts of not addressing climate change? One of the reasons we moved early and vigorously in Connecticut, because the same rules that address climate change are helping bring down asthma rates in our cities from dirty air that's blown over from other parts of the country. It doesn't just stay there, as many of our colleagues on the panel have pointed out. It moves, but also that pollution moves with it and has major health impacts on others who may not get to vote on those rules. And last, the role of technology, the upside of U.S. technology to address these issues and license them to the world. These same engineers who developed fracking technology can also be developing, and I would argue better off developing, clean, renewable energy technologies that can be licensed to the world where they need them desperately. So if you could address those, I'd be very grateful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Congresswoman Esty. First, I commend Connecticut for certainly doing exactly what you say. Until recently, your Commissioner of Environment was one of the best-known environmental economists in the world, Dan Esty, and what you managed to do is not only do the right thing, but you actually analyzed it, and you've actually shown that it works, which is a really remarkable thing. And by the way, it illustrates the point. I mean, coming back to fracking for a moment, fracking is a great blessing. If it's gas fracking, it can promote jobs and so on. By no means is that killed by the Paris deal whatsoever. On the contrary, one of the most important things we can do to address climate change is actually reduce methane leakage from fracking. And that actually will save money. It will help the frackers. At the moment, like in energy efficiency more generally, we're allowing stuff that we could be making money out of. So I think it illustrates the point that you were making, Congresswoman. On mayors, I mean, it really is amazing. You think about it. Why would 120 American mayors say, sign me up? We, as a city, we are going to measure our greenhouse gases. We're going to be transparent about our greenhouse gases. We're going to have plans for doing something about greenhouse gases. And every year we're going to come back, be totally transparent as to whether or not we're getting there. They don't have to do that. No one is telling them. It's not a law. And so too the 450 around the world. The reason they do it is because mayors are realizing their citizens want action. And they also see it as a way of doing things that they know they should have done all the time. And actually, this is giving them a little political boost to do things like smarter public transportation, like bike paths, things like that, which actually citizens want. I mean, we have 350 staff, 200 yards from here in our office. Half of them don't own cars. They don't want to be. It's a new era. They want bike paths. And so that would be one example. On the health impacts, Congresswoman, you know, we tend to think, well, China, obviously, you know, people are dying, and we know 7 million people are dying every year from air pollution, but clearly in this country, you know, we breathe clean air. Turns out that analysis shows that actually the clean power plant action will pay for itself just in health gains alone. That's a really remarkable thing. And on technology licensing, I mean, this is so crucial. I mean, why is it the high-tech companies are so keen that we take strong action? I mean, why are they lobbying? Why are they committed to, you know, 100% renewable? Why? And the reason is they see this as an amazing growth opportunity for the United States.
Thank you very much. I believe my time has expired. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Esty. Before we adjourn, a couple of items. First of all, without objection, I'd like to put in the record a letter signed by 300 independent scientists that express concern over NOAA's efforts to alter historical temperature data. Also, Dr. Steer, a colleague of ours, Senator Bill Cassidy of Pennsylvania, has asked me to pass along a question to you relevant to today's hearing. And could I give you that question momentarily and ask you to respond in writing to me sometime in the next week or so? Would that be all right? Okay, thank you. I just want to thank our witnesses. This has been an excellent hearing. We've learned a lot and appreciate all the expertise represented at our witness table today. And we stand adjourned.